All right, we got a great guest for you guys today to talk about healthcare. It's Thom Hartmann. He's the host of the Thom Hartmann program. That's on Sirius XM. It's on radio stations across the country. It's on Free Speech TV. But he's also a New York Times bestselling author. And his new book is called The Hidden History of American Healthcare. Thom, welcome back to the show, brother.
Hey, Cenk, it's great to be here with you, and it's so nice to see you again.
It's great to see you, man. All right, so Thom, let's talk history as we often do. Most of the developed nations have single-payer health care, so what that means is public health insurance, right? Now, some go beyond that, the UK does, et cetera, but we don't. Why did we diverge from everyone else? How did that happen?
It really began in the 1880s, 1890s when medicine became a thing. And there was this guy named Frederick Ludwig Hoffman who came over here from Germany. And he was a young man, he was 17 in fact when he came over, and was a numbers genius. And he hooked up with the Prudential Life Insurance Company, ended up being a vice president. And he was the guy who figured out that there was an association, a statistical association between working in a cotton mill and having lung problems, asbestos and mesothelioma, smoking and lung cancer. He published on that in the 1910s, in the 1890s and 1910s. And diet and cancer. In fact, his book on the association between a high processed food diet and cancer is still in print. He's been dead since 1946, but his book is still around. So he's really smart in these things. And so he married this Southern belle from Georgia who was from a racist plantation family. And so he ran the numbers on black people and found that black people were dying, dropping like flies, more likely to be sick, more likely to die of pretty much everything. And concluded, which was the general consensus at the time among a lot of white people in the South, this is again in the 1890s, that black people were genetically inferior. And in 1896, he published a book called Race, Tendencies and Traits of the American Negro, in which he lays out all the numbers, and then he concludes that if we simply avoided allowing black people to have any access to health care, that within 2 or 3 generations, the whole race would die out, and that would solve the race problem in America. Now, it sounds kind of crazy when I just lay it out like that right now, but this led to a whole bunch of things. By the 1920s, this was referred to as scientific racism. He was testifying about it before Congress. When Teddy Roosevelt, 1912, proposed a national health care system, people said no because black people will get it. When Franklin Roosevelt proposed a national health care system, it was the same thing. We don't want black people to get it. When Truman tried it in 47, same thing. Don't want black people to get it. Right up until 1965, Senator Stennis, the Dixiecrats in the South, was quoting Hoffman, who was by then dead, but is still very famous in this field, as saying this, we have to figure out a way to keep black people from using Medicare. This is when they were passing Medicare. And the way that they came up with was to have a 20% hole, a gap in Medicare, so that you had to pay 20% of your doctor's bill and your hospital bill, and that would discourage poor black people from showing up at the hospitals. I mean, it was the most shocking thing I discovered, Cenk, when I was doing the research on this book, is that nearly 100% of the reason why the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't define healthcare as a right and doesn't have any sort of national healthcare system to speak of is because of racism.
That's amazing. I love when you find hidden histories.
And that's why you've got 12 states that still haven't expanded Medicaid, right? Free health insurance for low income people, all former slave states.
Yeah, and so I remember when we talked about how Supreme Court clerk said that corporations were people, and how
John Chandler Davis in 1886.
Right, and how that started this whole corporations are people nonsense. It was never a Supreme Court decision, et cetera. Now this, but Thom, a lot of it seems to go back to race, and the more you look into American history, the more you realize it's not just original sin, that it's like a sickness that's still spreads and spreads and is still infecting us. So I remember when we were talking about guns, and the Second Amendment was because to support slave patrols. So
exactly.
And then talk to me about this interesting combination of capitalism and racism that we have in America that's produced what appears to be a toxic stew of not caring about one another. That it almost seems to have gone over from race to class. Like, hey, while we were not caring about black people and hoping that they would die quicker, we accidentally started doing that for poor people and then middle class people, and now the whole country is this kind of macabre, runaway, insane capitalism run amok, where we grind each other endlessly to the nub under corporate rule.
Yeah, a lot of what you're talking about falls under the larger rubric of neoliberalism, which, by the way, a year from now will be my next book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. And and that's the theory that markets are always smarter than bureaucrats. That capitalism is more important than democracy. That democracy, in fact, is outmoded and really needs to be. We'll give it lip service and everything, but what's really important is that the really smart people run everything, and the really smart people we know, of course, are the really rich people. It's like an economic version of Calvinism. The Calvinist theory that people like Betsy DeVos subscribe to, that all people are sinners. So how do we know who to pick to lead us? Well, God tells us by making some people rich, and those are the people who are God's chosen few. Well, you just tweak that slightly, and you've got Hayek and Mises and Friedman, their neoliberal theory that the people who are the chosen ones are the ones who are rich because the market chose them, because they're their own intelligence. And this brutality of the marketplace is destroying us. And this, we had a period in the United States from the 30s to the 80s, and you and I have talked about this before. I'm not sure if it was on the air or if it was over a beer years ago, but we had this period between the 30s and the 80s where we actually had capitalism to a significant extent kind of regulated and in a box, or at least the capitalists. And then Reagan came in and just introduced all these neoliberal reforms, radically cutting the top taxes that were maintaining, some level of equality, and inequality just exploded, and deregulating, industry after industry, leading to monopolies. And and when you throw race into that mix, then you get things like redlining, this whole toxic stew that we're seeing, that inappropriate policing, George Floyd being murdered. I mean, it's really all one giant kind of ball of string that it's really hard to pull pieces out and think that and find they're not discrete. They're all interconnected.
Yeah, and our foreign policy in that case, it's less about black people, more about Muslims, but a fear of the others, a hatred of the others, and easy to say, oh, Muslims, all they understand is violence. That's why we had to kill them all. And by the way, we've been running that racket for a long, long time in the West. The conquistadors coming over and saying, well, I spoke Spanish to the local indigenous tribes, and they didn't understand me, so they were obviously savages, so I had to murder them. So that's been going around. But healthcare is about whether people get to stay alive or not. And so it's supposed to be the core mission of the government: police, military, fire department, protect the citizens, right? If government's good for anything, and even the right wing agree to that, it should be to protect citizens. And so that's why health insurance is public everywhere else. So let's go back to that issue. It starts out first as this way to say, hey, let's get black people to die quicker if we don't give them insurance, which is unbelievable, right? As a justification, and unfortunately in American history, quite believable. But then is there a tipping point, Thom, where they go, oh, now we're making a lot of money off this private health insurance because we charge them more and then we give them less and then we keep the profit? And does that take on a life of its own and hit a tipping point at some point?
Yeah, I mean, you raised kind of two issues. One is the commons, and the other is just the history of how we got here. Scientific racism pushed us or prevented us from getting a national healthcare system right up until the 70s. After that, what happened was in the 50s and 60s and 70s, the health insurance industry came into its own. And when Reagan deregulated them just massively, I mean, deregulated everything in the 80s, ordered the Justice Department and the SEC, or whichever federal agency it is, to stop enforcing the antitrust laws. We went from hundreds of insurance companies to dozens now to really 6 or 7 really large ones. And so now the main force against a national health policy is the fact that you've got a handful of health insurance companies that are literally making $1 billion a day, or at least a couple $1 billion a week in profits. And to peel off a few $100 million to buy a few politicians of the entire Republican Party and enough Democrats, they gave Joe Lieberman $1 million and he killed the public option, for example. So now it's money. It's not racism any longer. There's a piece there, but it's pretty faded away. Now it's all about the money. The larger issue that you raised is the one of the commons. And this is the discussion. I think this is the key, and what you just raised, Cenk, I think is the magic key that unlocks the whole thing. We have not had a reasonable debate in the United States since the 80s about what the commons is. What is the stuff that we all own together, we all administer together, and that is the appropriate function of government. And at one, pre-Reagan, we agreed that we don't want the government making our cars or our blue jeans. But we do, there's only one power line coming into my house. And so it should be provided by a company that is answerable to me, that's owned by its people, by its consumers and its community. And now we're down to about, I think it's around 40% of electricity generated in the United States is publicly owned. It used to be like 80, 90%. Same with water supplies, same with septic, less so with septic because there's not so much profit to be made there. But we really did this with fire departments. I mean, you got libertarians like Rand Paul. I mean, these guys, they want to go back to an era when you had to pay the fire department and they put a shield on your house. And if your house caught on fire and you didn't have their shield, their trucks would just drive on by. That was normal in the United States until the 1920s and 30s. And then as people, community, particularly after the big Chicago fire in the late 1800s, people in America figured out that if one house caught on fire, it could catch the next house on fire and the next house, and this is a bad thing. So we all agreed that we would all chip in to pay for the fire department, and that it's the commons. Well, if my house being on fire is so important that we should call it part of the commons and pay for it with our taxes collectively, isn't my body even more valuable if it catches on fire, metaphorically? If it gets cancer, I get in a car accident, whatever. Shouldn't that be part of the commons too? And I think that's the next step in the big conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah, unfortunately, all these come back to the two issues that I talk about most often, which is money and media. So I'll come back to money in a second. You mentioned something that's really important there, but on this one, it's the media, because you could easily say, hey, listen, you know what catches from house to house? A virus does, in the middle of a pandemic, for example. And so this was a moment where everybody recognized that we needed to get free tests, free vaccines for the American people because our lives are on the line. And then, the very next question is, well, aren't our lives on the line on all important healthcare issues? And even more so than perhaps even fire or police, which happens more rarely, and is more contagious. Everybody's going to have healthcare issues. Everybody is, and it's going to literally endanger their lives. But yet, none of the media talk about that. None of them took the opportunity of COVID to discuss, hey, maybe we should do what every other developed nation does. And of course, you saw it in the Bernie Sanders campaigns. How are you going to pay for that? Oh, it's 32 trillion. Now, they still do it to this day, Tom. I still read articles where they say, they quote the Koch brothers study without naming that it was the Koch brothers who paid for it, say that Medicare for All would cost 32 trillion, and leave out that it would save $34 trillion from the economy. I mean, so isn't the core of the problem really the media? Because it's the lens through which we can't see right.
It's a large part of it, Cenk, and that's why I think that programs like yours and networks like yours, like the Young Turks, are so important. That that we have alternative media in the United States, but the official, the mainstream, the corporate media, whatever you want to call it, has gotten so. I mean, obviously there are partisans and people acting within that world who have hidden agendas or sometimes very upfront agendas, but there's also an enormous amount of basically laziness going on. And I think your example of citing that Koch brothers study is a good one. And it's like when there was this big hysteria when Trump was during the early COVID, and he was like, oh my God, immigrants are going to bring COVID into the country. And at the same time, you had him and governors going, what? Look at this. California wants to give free healthcare to immigrants. Oh my God. And I'm like, wait a minute. These two messages don't make any sense. I mean, do you want the guy who's sitting next to you on the park bench or on the bus or whatever, who might be an immigrant, and therefore, because you're so noble, doesn't have health insurance, to be coughing his tuberculosis or his COVID on you? I mean, shouldn't everybody be healthy? Isn't that, it's like your point about, viruses don't have walls. I mean, they just move around. Yeah. So this common sense stuff doesn't even get raised in these conversations, which is infuriating.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, it's so obvious and such common sense that when it doesn't get raised, you wonder why. And of course, the tremendous amount of the millions of dollars in drug company money and health insurance money that goes into advertising on cable news and most of the print media as well.
We're one of only two countries in the developed world that allows pharmaceutical companies to advertise on television. Us and New Zealand. That's it.
Yeah. And well, that's working out great for us. Okay, and now I go back to money. I mean, Thom, how are we going to get Medicare for All? Because the Medicare for All is this single payer. It's what would make us like every other developed nation. Our media lies 24/7 that it costs more when every other nation it costs less. In fact, on average, it costs half as much. And okay, but let's say we get beyond that, but then our politicians are literally bought. They're corrupt. And so and of course, there's another, goes back to the media because they won't call them corrupt. Oh, Joe Lieberman took $1 million for his health and for your health. Absurd. For what? For charity. Absurd. But Thom, how are we going to solve any of these issues if the politicians are bought? Don't you have to solve money in politics first?
Well, that of course the answer is yes to an extent, and that's the answer also to how do we get clean elections, and how do we there's so many things that nice things that Americans can't have that everybody else in the developed world has because of money in politics. You're absolutely right, and that's huge. But in terms of practical implementation, the way that Canada got Medicare for All was Tommy Douglas was the premier of Saskatchewan, a province. We would call it a state. We would call him a governor, back in the 60s, and he did it. He just did it. He'd been in the federal Congress for a couple of years and tried to do it. Didn't work, so he thought, okay, I'll go back to my state and just do it at the state level. Got elected premier and made it happen. And then Alberta said, hey, that looks pretty good, let's try that. And then Ontario said, oh, we've got to have that. And it spread across the country within a couple of years. And then the federal government got in and said, we'll backstop you guys and set some standards. And now you've got a national system. But it's still administered by the individual states in Canada. In the United States, both Vermont and California have voted for this. Their legislatures have passed it. A friend of mine was the head of HEW in Vermont when it got passed. And his job was to put it into place. And what he discovered, and sadly, California discovered the same thing, is that there's this weird quirk in the Medicare and Medicaid laws that LBJ wanted there in the 60s. He wanted them so that states couldn't take the federal money for Medicare and Medicaid and then refuse to give it to certain people. And we're talking about black people here. FDR wanted to make sure that they couldn't just serve white people. And so there's this line of data that has to go from the federal government to the consumer, essentially. It's direct with Medicare. I mean, Medicare is direct payments to the federal government. In the states, with Medicaid, it goes through the states, but there's still that line that has to be tracked. And so when Vermont went to the federal government and said, we're going to do single payer, we just passed it, the legislature passed it, the governor signed it, we're ready to implement it. The federal government said, well, that's all well and good, but no more Medicare money is going to come into your state, which is billions a year. All the people over 65, you're going to have to figure out how to pay for them. And no more Medicaid money is going to come into your state, which was billions of dollars a year. A lot of low income people in Vermont. because of this quirk in the law that was written in to prevent the racists from misusing Medicare and Medicaid back in the 60s. You could fix that with probably a 3-page piece of legislation that basically just strips out those provisions. That has been proposed dozens of times over the last 20 years, always by Democrats, always shot down by Republicans. But if we could get, they're called waivers, if we could get state waivers, state Medicare and Medicaid waivers, if we could get that put into federal law, then California and Vermont tomorrow morning would have single payer systems. Medicare systems, Medicare for All systems. And I guarantee you, just like with Canada, within a decade, every other state, or at least most of the other states, would follow suit, and you would have it federal backstopped. But the health insurance companies are fighting it tooth and nail, and the Republicans are fighting it tooth and nail, which takes us back to your point, Cenk, and which you are constantly talking about, and God bless you for it, that if we don't get money out of politics in this country, we're just sliding toward oligarchy every single day.
Right, because we got 1 minute left, Tom. But those insurance companies and also the drug companies who greatly benefit from this, they're not just doing the ads on television, and they're not just giving the money to politicians for charity. Obviously, I mean, and that's why the media drives me crazy. It's de facto bribery. It is, and that's really the #1 reason why we don't have what every other developed nation has. Is that about right? It's not even quite bribery, Cenk. It's more like we've got this old boys club here, and we're inviting you in. We're the health insurance industry, and we're making billions, and you're the media industry, and you're making billions. Let's share some of our billions and have a common interest here. That's what's going on. Yeah, for the media, that's more true. For the politicians, it's as close to flat out bribery as it gets.
Yeah, it's well bribery, yeah.
All right, look, everybody check out The Hidden History of American Healthcare. As usual, a brilliant job by Thom Hartmann, longtime progressive host and one of the best progressive hosts in the country. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Cenk. It's always great talking with you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.